What we're going to talk about today is something that I've been getting questions about recently, which is the difference between hardness and hardenability. In a basic sense, hardness refers obviously to how hard the steel got in the heat treat, whereas hardenability refers to how easily the steel can be completely transformed to martensite. And it's hardenability that we are referring to when we talk about a steel that is a water hardening steel, or a oil hardening steel, or an air hardening steel for that matter. And really what it comes down to, well, I'll back up for a second. So hardness is mostly, not entirely, but mostly dictated by carbon content. So the more carbon you have, up to a degree, the harder the steel will get. So this is why steels like W2 can be made very, very hard. However, up to somewhere around 67 Rockwell. However, W2 has actually very low hardenability, which is why folks who do Japanese style clayed heat treats, where they want to develop a nice hamon, really like W2. W2, like I was saying, very low hardenability, which is why it is typically classified as a water hardening steel. Sort of the counterexample to that would be something like, a really common one would be 4140, which is a oil hardening steel, so higher hardenability, but only hardens to a maximum of let's say around 60 Rockwell, and that's before tempering. So it's a lot easier to harden, but you aren't going to get as much hardness from it. An even more extreme example would be something like S7, which is an air hardening steel. So you just pull it out of the furnace and let it cool in the air, and it will harden completely. It'll transform completely to martensite. It is also a slightly softer steel. Again, hardens up to, I believe, around 61 Rockwell, something like that. I don't really use S7, so I might be off on that a little bit. But again, not quite as hard, very high hardenability. Now, don't take my examples to mean that there aren't high hardenability steels that get very hard, because there certainly are. Again, I have a few steels that I work with a lot, and those are the ones I like, so I don't have all the specs for all the steels right there in my head. Now, what affects hardness? Like I said, a big factor, a really big factor, is carbon content. Starting, for just carbon steels, so for the 10XX series steels, you're really looking at, you need, it's only, it isn't until you get to like 1060, 1065 that you can start to get a full transformation to martensite without having some residual ferrite in there that makes it a little softer. It's also very difficult to quench something like 1065 fast enough to achieve full martensite. And that is where we start to get into why is hardenability, why is it the way it is? Why, what causes differences in hardenability? Really what it comes down to is speed at which perlite forms. As you're cooling, this is what's called a TTT, or time temperature transformation diagram. And I've done just a very simplified one. And, you know, different steels have a different critical temperature. And, you know, for the most part, this area here where we see what's often referred to as the nose of the curve is roughly the same, you know, sort of in the vicinity of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And down here we see the beginning of, or the martensite transformation zone. So basically, around 600 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly, you start to transform to martensite, and that isn't completed until you pass below 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So, what causes the nose of the curve, as we say? That is the temperature at which perlite forms fastest. Perlite, like most things in steel, perlite forms by essentially seeding in one place and spreading from there. Remember that each of these transformations that occurs involves the atoms themselves shifting around. In this case, we're going from a face-centered cubic austenite to a body-centered cubic lower temperature structure. And obviously, if we achieve martensite, it's going to be, I believe they refer to it as tetragonal, but basically it's a body-centered cube that's been shifted off, you know, so it's out of whack. Thus the strain inherent in it, and thus the hardness. And what does that is carbon, trapping carbon in there. And when we say trapped carbon, we mean carbon that did not get to go back to being carbide or cementite. That is the preferred structure for carbon in low temperature steels. When you don't have austenite, that face-centered cubic structure, in which up to about 2.2% carbon can be dissolved, your lower temperature structures, ferrite actually will only hold like 0.005% carbon. It's something really, it's ridiculously tiny. So all the rest of the carbon has to become carbide. It actually gets kicked out, bonds with 3 iron atoms, and bam, you get carbide instead. Perlite, which hopefully you're familiar with, is basically a lamellar or banded structure of ferrite, which is essentially pure iron, and carbide, which is cementite or iron carbide. And since things have to move around, atoms have to move around to change these structures, the higher the carbon content, the less likely you are for those atoms to, the carbon atoms to have a chance to move and become carbide. So you are going to get more carbon trapped, you're going to get a higher hardness martensite. Also, you're more likely to get carbon trapped everywhere, so everything will transform to martensite, as opposed to going back to being, having that carbide go back to being, having that carbon go back to being carbide in either in perlite or as just kind of free roaming carbide. However, excess carbon actually begins to reduce hardenability at a certain point. And there's kind of 2 reasons for this. One, if you don't put all that carbon into solution, you have these little carbides floating around. And just like when you're forming ice crystals or anything that needs to precipitate, those carbides act as a precipitation point for perlite. So having a lot of carbide in there, or a lot of carbides floating around, actually lowers your hardenability. Assuming that you can actually get a good quench, you do everything right, you get your quench right, and you do get a transformation to martensite, those carbides, those excess carbides, will actually contribute to the hardness. Hardness is just the resistance of the steel to deformation. So basically, can you put a dent in it? How big a dent? That's what the hardness tests. Hardness testers, that's what they test. And so if you have that carbide also trapped in there, it does overall stiffen the matrix of the steel somewhat. But like I said, that excess carbon and therefore carbides, or possibly therefore carbides, can make it harder to get a full transformation to martensite because they aid the precipitation of perlite. The other way in which very high carbon can affect hardenability is in the form of retained austenite. If you have an excess of carbon in solution, and for, I don't know the exact reasons why this is the case, but excess of carbon in solution, when you're at critical, and in this case, probably above critical, when you quench, you are likely to get some retained austenite. And you'll get this in fairly simple carbon steels. Not a lot, but a little bit. Stainless steels and very high alloy steels are much more known for it. But essentially, the way to deal with that, if you do think you're getting retained austenite, if essentially you're not getting the hardness you think you should, try doing a cryogenic cycle on that. Take it down, minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that, just as you would with a stainless steel, and then retemper and see whether you get higher hardness. If you don't get higher hardness, then your issue is not, or probably is not retained austenite. If you do get higher hardness, retained austenite is your issue, so you need to go back and look at your system. But getting a little off track here, going back to 4140 versus W2, I've kind of sketched in two curves on here, two noses. And the difference between these is that here, that spacing is, would be for W2. That basically you need to get below 1,000 degrees in this case, about a second to be able to achieve full martensite. And in this case, full martensite refers to as much as you could have had based on your austenization. Oof, that's a tough one to say. By that I mean, so if you've got retained carbide, that's not what I'm talking about, not that excess carbide. What I'm talking about is instead partial transformation to perlite. And I'm also not referring to retained austenite. That retained austenite, most of it anyways, should be able to get transformed to martensite. If you've cooled quickly enough, it's not going to transform to perlite. It will transform to martensite, assuming you can get it to transform. But if you cut through the nose of that curve, if your cooling rate is not fast enough, you're going to get some transformation to perlite. And by contrast, here we are with 4140. Again, doesn't get as hard, easier to harden. The spacing there is more like 2 to 3 seconds. You have, it doesn't seem like much, but you're not dropping a lot of temperature here. And that's essentially the difference between a water hardening steel and an oil hardening steel. The oil hardening steel, if you get below that nose in 2 seconds, you're good. You're golden. Especially if you continue to cool at a fairly respectable pace, because you could pass the nose there, and then kind of drift back through, and you're going to get some mixed structures. You're going to get some oddball stuff there. You will probably get some perlite. You will probably get some bainite, but probably some of it would be high temperature bainite, which, based on my understanding, isn't very desirable. Some of it would be low temperature bainite, and probably you'd still end up with some martensite as well. Now that mixed structure, probably not the best. One thing to keep in mind when looking at transformation diagrams, the TTT diagrams, is make sure you know what size material it was for. A lot of times these things, they're for industry, so they're done for larger material than you may be using. As a knife maker, even if you're just hardening a blank and then grinding afterwards, it's probably what, 1/4 inch thick. So if this cooling curve, or the TTT curve, is based on a 1 inch diameter rod, well, you're going to be cooling a lot faster with your 1/4 inch material. So it's going to be a lot easier. It doesn't change necessarily where this curve is. So something like W2, if you were quenching a 1 inch rod, the outside of it would harden fully, but the core of it would not harden fully. 4140 would, at the same, kind of in the same situation, would harden more deeply. And this is why you also sometimes hear the terms deep hardening versus shallow hardening steels. And that's essentially just another way of talking about the hardenability of the steel. Were you able to cool quickly enough to get full transformation to martensite all the way to the center, or how deeply did you get that hardness? So again, just kind of to quickly reiterate this, oil hardening steels, you've got 2 to 3 seconds, generally speaking, to get below 1100 degrees, or about 1000 degrees roughly, versus water hardening steels, in which case you typically have a second or less to get below 1000 degrees. And this really explains why you can get such nice homones in those water hardening steels, because your edge, your exposed edge, where you don't have clay, is going to pretty easily pass that curve. But it doesn't take much of a delay. You don't have to insulate very much at all to pass partly through that curve, and then as you get, perhaps a little deeply, a little deeper up under that clay, closer to the spine, where it's not only insulated by the clay itself, but kind of insulated by the heat transfer rate of the steel, you're going to pass even further through the curve. So, and maybe far enough up that you get complete perlite. It'll be very fine-grained perlite, but it's completely perlite. So the reason to know about this is so when you're buying a steel and you see, oh, it's oil hardening, it's water hardening, whatever, you have a better idea what that means. Also, so you know the difference between hardness and hardenability. Buying a steel with high hardenability does not mean that you're going to get a very hard steel. It also tells us something else that's interesting. Sometimes you'll see folks who say, take 5160, which is very much an oil hardening steel. It does not need to be cooled quickly to achieve full martensite. Folks will take 5160 and they will water quench it, and because they feel that this gives them higher hardness. Well, you might get a very, very small amount of higher hardness with 5160 in a water quench, but you're also going to get a huge amount of excess stress that just wasn't necessary. If you want a really high hardness steel, 5160 wasn't the right choice. Whereas if you wanted a very tough steel that still holds a good edge, then 5160 was the right choice. So knowing about the hardenability would tell you, oh, okay, 5160, very high hardenability, not water or not air hardening level, but definitely oil hardening level. Harden that in oil, get its best properties, get that toughness, get a good 62 Rockwell, as hardened. Temper it back a bit. You've got yourself a great chopping blade, great sword, whatever it is that's intended to be tough. If you want that super hard edge, 5160 isn't your steel. Something like W2 is your steel. And like I said, there are other higher alloy, higher hardenability steels that will also achieve that very hard edge. But, just talking about some of the ones that are commonly used, W2 comes to mind. So yeah, and again, what this comes back to is the movement of atoms, which is kind of mind-blowing to me that we're here, playing around with steel, and based on how we treat it, we change how the atoms themselves move. And having that knowledge allows you to understand why things happen the way they do. So again, feel free to ask questions. I really appreciate questions, and if you've got suggestions for future videos, also great, put them in the comments, or you can swing over to my Instagram account, which is Peter Burt Knives, or @PeterBurtKnives, and ask questions there as well. So hope you enjoyed and got a little bit out of this.